Chapter 8, February 21, 1863. Nissa woke from a dreamless sleep, happy not to have wrestled with some vision in her slumber for once. Traumatic as the accident had been, it seemed to have put an end to her nocturnal horrors. She was in a place she knew better than any other, her bedroom on Traken. It felt good to be home again. She tried to sit up and winced, pain lancing across her chest. There was a dressing over the wound, held in place by bandages wrapped around her torso. Gritting her teeth against the stabbing sensation, Nissa sat up and swung her legs off the bed. As always, her feet didn't quite touch the floor. All her childhood, she had dreamed of being tall enough to sit on this bed and have long enough legs for them to reach the ground. When her father had heard of this, he suggested trimming a few inches off the bed's legs to make the dream a reality. But Nissa's mother wouldn't hear of it. That would be cheating, Lucina had announced, and you should never cheat your dreams. Nissa stood and looked out of the window at the gardens. She could see her father tending the trees and vines below, testing the success of his latest invention, an underground irrigation system. Soon, it would be time to gather the feijoa and tamarillo, and the house would be suffused with the sweet, sickly smell of fruit being boiled. The scent always made her gag a little, so strong and pungent was the aroma, but nothing was more redolent of the harvest season. She could mark the passage of time just by recalling what had happened to her with each harvest, starting lessons, getting her first guardian toy Bibi, becoming a woman, her first kiss. She wondered what this season would bring. "Nissa, are you up yet?" Her mother was calling from the cooking area near the courtyard, the sound of cutlery and plates being passed from hand to hand, signalling that the morning meal was nearly ready. "Come and help with the table." "I'm just dressing," Nissa called back, not concentrating on what her mother was saying. The wound would hamper her movements for a few days yet, so she chose a simple dress of scarlet and crimson hues, without too many fastenings. Putting something on her feet was too much like hard work, so Nissa ventured out into the courtyard barefoot, eager to quell the rumbling in her stomach. She couldn't remember the last time she had eaten, and the cold collation of meats and fruits on the table looked delicious. Standing beside the table was a small child in a blue tunic, a pouch sewn into the material. "Hello," Nissa said. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" The child whispered a reply. "Don't trust them. Nothing here is what it seems." Lucina walked into the courtyard from the cooking area, a tray laden with steaming bowls of food balanced in her arms. "Good, you're up at last. Your father and I were beginning to wonder if you'd ever get out of that bed. Clear a space on the table, you two." Nissa obliged, shifting the other food from the centre of the oblong table. The child had to kneel on one of the benches to help her. Once they were finished, Lucina laid her tray in the gap. "There. Nissa, go and call Tremas while your brother helps me bring in the rest." "My brother?" Nissa stopped short, registering what her mother had said. "But I don't have a brother. I'm an only child." Lucina looked at her in puzzlement. "Of course you have a brother, Nissa. He's standing right in front of you. Aren't you, dear?" The small boy nodded, but his eyes widened as he looked at Nissa. Volmer had ventured upriver to view the temporary dam, leaving Johnson and Hawthorne to guard the doctor. The weak winter sunshine had been enough to burn away the last remnants of morning mist, but clouds were forming in the distance, and a cool breeze filtered through the trees around the encampment. The sooner they got away from this place, the happier Volmer would be. The sergeant had come to a decision. Already, the water level beyond the dam was more than halfway up the structure. They had a day, perhaps two, before Clark's work gave way and a flash flood tore down the valley. Volmer walked back into camp and relieved Johnson and Hawthorne from guard duty. Once the pair had moved off, the sergeant undid the chains binding the doctor in place and took the prisoner for a walk. The two men strolled along the crest of the hill to a point from where they could see all the activity below. The water is just a quarter of its usual level, the doctor noted. The General won't need the diving bell for his next expedition. Doctor, I think you were right. Dalton, he's not in his right mind. He plans to execute you when he gets back. He said if you escaped, he would have me shot instead. Is that what you would expect from him? The sergeant shook his head. It's as if his reason is unhinged. The choices he is making, the orders he is giving, they make no sense to me. Volmer decided he would have to trust this civilian. I've been up to view the temporary dam. How long will it hold? Days, perhaps only hours. That may be a blessing, the doctor said thoughtfully. Her Majesty will most likely be here later today. It is far too dangerous for her to visit this place. I don't know why the General invited her. I fear that I do. The doctor held up his manacled wrists. If you want me to help save the Queen, these shackles will have to come off. But once you do that, I would be disobeying a direct order from the General, the sergeant sighed. Gross insubordination. He would not need an excuse to have me shot after that. Have you heard of the Rubicon? The doctor asked, but Volmer shook his head. It's a waterway in northern Italy, not unlike the river below us. In ancient times, it marked the boundary between Italy and Cisalpine Gaul. Julius Caesar led his army across the Rubicon in 49 BC and thus committed himself to civil war with the senatorial party of the day. Splendid chap, Julius, but far too trusting of those around him. It was a point of no return, Volmer said. Yes, he committed himself irrevocably to a course of action. Take off my shackles, and you will do the same. The doctor held out his hands. I want to rescue my friend Nissa from beyond the rift. I want to stop the General from making a terrible mistake. But I need your help. I can't do all of that alone. It's up to you, Sergeant. Volmer produced a tiny key. I'll do it, but there's no guarantee Clark or one of the others will not just put those shackles straight back on you again. The General has a very strong command of his men. The doctor smiled. Then we must find a way around that. After the morning feast, Nissa volunteered to take her brother for a walk in the gardens, suggesting it would do them both good to get out of the house and feel the sun's warmth on their skin. Lucina was only too eager to accept. I know there are many seasons between you in age, but it would be good if you spent more time together. Besides, Trimas and I have much to discuss now you're home, Nissa. She gave her daughter an affectionate hug. It's good to have you back. Just don't let your brother kill any more birds with his slingshot. I know they peck at the fruit, but their song is so lovely in the morning. Nissa slipped on some simple shoes before leading the young boy out of the courtyard and down some stone steps to the gardens. Who are you? What are you doing here? I don't have a brother. The boy smiled. I have 2 brothers. Or maybe I just dreamed them. It gets hard to remember what's real if you've been here more than a day. What's your name? James. James Lees. But that's impossible, Nissa said. I met you in Windsor. She stopped, trying to hold on to that certainty in her head. I mean, I thought I had met you, but Nissa frowned. It's as if I've got another life in my head, another set of memories, but they keep slipping away. James nodded. Nissa looked at his features and remembered another, older face, thinner and longer, but still the same. James wasn't her brother, she knew that much as a certainty. But why did her mother say that he was? Perhaps it was some after-effect of the accident, yet she couldn't remember suffering any memory loss. Then again, would she? Nissa could feel her thoughts tying themselves into knots. Before, you said nothing here is what it seems. What did you mean? She asked. Come with me, James replied, running ahead of her on the path between the trees. Come on, I'll show you the others. The others? What others? Nissa called, hurrying after the boy. The sun had passed its peak when Dalton was ready to travel back through the gateway. By now the water level had fallen still further, so the rocks of Corallin towered over what was left of the river. The pontoon jetted out uselessly over the slowly drying banks. The general gathered most of his men by the water's edge. Those who had already been to the other side were making preparations for the Queen's visit, tidying the camp and erecting a special tent should she choose to stay for the night. Dalton marched back and forth as he addressed the troops. "Men, you are about to embark on the greatest adventure of your lives. On the other side, you will see sights to amaze and astound. You may well be greeted by your dearly departed. They welcome all those who make the journey to the afterlife. Whatever happens, you must retain discipline. Follow my lead, and no harm shall befall you. Are you with me?" "Yes, sir," the soldiers shouted back in unison. "Very well. Make ready to swim down to the gateway. It is now only a few feet below the surface and can be reached without special equipment. Dismissed!" Private Johnson grinned broadly. At last he was getting a chance to see what Thorny had witnessed on the other side. This was going to be the adventure of a lifetime. James had brought Nissa through the gardens and under a boundary marker to a tall stone building at the edge of the family estate. The circular tower was featureless and foreboding on this side, just a handful of gaps in the stone letting light inside. "They keep the others in there," James said, pointing at the hole just above the ground. "Who are they?" Nissa asked, but the boy did not reply. James was too busy scooping up pebbles and rocks from nearby and tucking them into his pouch. She dropped to the ground and looked inside. The cell was small and square, just big enough for a man to lie down without his head or feet touching the walls. It was dark inside, and difficult to see how many men were being kept within the chamber, but Nissa counted close to a dozen squeezed into the limited space. They were clothed in grubby red tunics and dark blue trousers, their faces wretched and terrified, even in sleep. One of the men stirred, looking up at the hole in the wall. He seemed startled to see a face peering down at him. The man stirred and approached Nissa, reaching up a hand towards her. "Are you an angel or a demon?" "Neither," she replied, pushing her hand between the bars to touch the tops of his fingers. "Who are you? What are you doing here? Please, you must help us. We have to get back." "Get back? Where did you come from?" "The other side. We have to get back to the other side. Demons with the faces of our loved ones have been torturing us with visions, even in our sleep. Please, you must help us, Nissa." That startled her. "How did you know my name? Don't you remember we were—" "What are you doing here?" an angry voice demanded. Nissa turned round to see a figure looming over her, the bright sun overhead turning her accuser into a menacing silhouette. "This place is forbidden, even for you, my child." "Father, I didn't know, "Enough!" Tremas snapped. "Well, you're here now. What's done is done. I suppose this day had to happen. Come." Tremas strode away round the building, pausing only to call for them. "Follow me if you want to see what's inside." Clark had been on lookout duty for the royal entourage since the general had led 36 soldiers down into the water. The lance corporal paid little attention when he saw the 3 soldiers approaching, until he realized they were dressed in the uniform of royal household guards. The trio were marching ahead of the Queen, who was sitting side-saddle on a fine dappled mare. Behind her, 2 women in black picked their way through the undergrowth, faces curled in disdain. They were flanked by 3 more soldiers. Clark hurried forwards to greet the royal entourage and lead it to the encampment. Her Majesty was unhappy that Dalton was not present to greet her, having summoned her to the site. Victoria announced her plans to leave in a few hours for Lanark, as it seemed there was no suitable accommodation closer. "We did not travel for the better part of 2 days to be so treated," she concluded. "It would have been safer if your Majesty had not travelled here at all," the doctor replied. He walked into Her Majesty's presence and bowed deeply, followed by Volmer. Clark reacted with anger at seeing the prisoner without shackles. "What is the meaning of this, Sergeant? The General ordered this murderer to be kept in chains until he can be tried and executed." "What is this?" the Queen demanded. "Who has been murdered, and why do you speak of trials and executions?" "Your Majesty, if I may explain," Clark began, but was cut off by Volmer. "Silence, Lance Corporal! I outrank you, and I shall tell Her Majesty precisely what has been happening here, not you." The sergeant's voice brooked no opposition, and Clark reluctantly stepped aside, his face blushing a crimson close to the colour of his hair. "What is your name, Sergeant?" Victoria asked. "Volmer, Your Majesty. Charles Otto Volmer." "A good German name. Very well, you may speak." The sergeant quickly outlined the events of the past few days, noting the General's increasingly irrational behaviour and the accusations of murder levelled against the doctor. When Volmer had finished, the Queen asked where James Lees's body was being kept. "We should like to look upon his face one last time. He brought us hope," she said quietly. "The General has made no special provision for it, ma'am," Volmer said as he led her to the body, stored at the northern edge of the encampment. "Coffins were purchased for the 2 officers who died, but Master Lees's body is merely resting in a canvas bag." At the Queen's urging, the bag was opened to expose the young man's face. She shook her head a little at seeing him. "A great sadness," Victoria said, "but we feel certain of seeing him on the other side, perhaps with our beloved consort." She signalled for the bag to be pulled back up into place. The Queen returned to her ladies-in-waiting and sent them off to prepare her lodgings for the night at Lanark, taking 3 of the household guards with them. "Well, Doctor, what do you have to say for yourself?" "Your Majesty, I know you have no reason to trust me," he began. "I have been accused of pretending to have an allegiance to Scotland Yard, of being an agent provocateur for a foreign power, of being an assassin and a murderer. But I am none of these things. I am simply a scientist, intent on discovering the truth about the strange phenomenon you yourself experienced in the mausoleum at Frogmore. I travelled north into Scotland at your request with my companion Nyssa to further this investigation. I believe the world beyond this gateway is not what it seems. I have no proof beyond my own suspicions, but I believe them to be true." "Where is Lady Nyssa?" Victoria asked. "My apologies, ma'am. I neglected to mention her earlier," Volmer replied. "The General took her through the gateway. He and his men returned, but she did not. We have no knowledge of her fate." "All of this is most distressing and irregular," the Queen said. "We arrived to find a once trusted adviser bearing the marks of hours spent in shackles, like the vilest of brigands. We learn of mysterious deaths and accidental killings. And we have been told wildly varying accounts of what lies beyond this gateway to the spirit world. Who are we to believe?" A shout drifted up from the water's edge. "There's someone coming back!" "The General, no doubt," Clark said with a smile. "Now you shall know the truth of the matter, Your Majesty." "What is this place?" Nyssa asked. She and James were being led by Tremas down a circular flight of stairs within the tower. It was dark inside, but a pale glow emanating from the walls offered enough light to see where they were going. "To everything there is an opposite. For every animal there exists a predator," Tremas explained. "Even in a paradise like this, evil can invade and insinuate itself." "But I thought all the Melkers were dealt with by the Grove," Nyssa said. "Some horrors are beyond the power of even that sacred place to heal. This tower was built to house the unwanted, the unwelcome. It gave us no satisfaction, but it was thought to be for the best. Others had more radical solutions. He stopped at the foot of the stairs and gestured to a doorway. We keep our demons in here. Do you want to see them more closely? See these basest of creatures for yourself? James shook his head, but Nissa was willing to look inside. Tremas began to unlock the door, but discovered it was already undone. Curious. That should not be. Sometimes I fear we become too trusting, even in such a benign world as this. He opened the door and followed Nissa inside. Ahead was the cell she had seen from outside, the men cowering against the far wall, keeping as far from Tremas as possible. Nissa felt a curious fluttering inside her mind. Something wasn't right here. Of that much she was certain. If only she still had her journal, she could be taking notes about all of this. Frustration clenched her thoughts, knowing a realization was just beyond her reach. She examined the faces of the men. They all seemed so familiar, especially the one who had spoken to her earlier. Where had she seen him before? These are our guilty secret, Tremas explained. We keep them in this place until they are no longer needed. Then, he sighed, then we shall see. Who are they? Where did they come from? Nissa asked. They invaded our paradise, intent on bringing their evil into our world. But that shall not be. Tremas rested a gentle hand on Nissa's shoulder and began to lead her out of the cell. Do you understand now why I did not wish you or James to come here? There is nothing of good to be... He stopped and looked back at the captives. Where is he? A red-haired prisoner responded first. Who? Tremas launched himself at the captive, hands clasping the man's throat. Where is he? Tell me! The prisoner choked, trying to pull the fingers away from his neck. Nissa tried to tear them apart. Please, father, stop! You're hurting him! Instead, Tremas tightened his grip, the sound of bone grinding against bone followed by cracking from the prisoner's throat. The dead man's eyes rolled back in his head, and Tremas cast the corpse aside, reaching for another prisoner. Nissa staggered backwards, horrified at what Tremas was doing. Father, please! He glared at her over his shoulder, his features contorted with hatred. Silence, my child, or you will be next. Tremas turned back to the prisoner. Where is the general? Dalton could not recall how long he had been on this side of the gateway. When he first opened his eyes, the general found himself surrounded by old friends lost on the battlefield. They seemed pleased to see him, stripping away his diving suit and weapons. He would have no need of them here, they explained. This was paradise, the world beyond death. But Dalton had refused to give up his pistol, given to him by the Queen in gratitude for his gallant service in the Crimea. He had explained why he wanted to keep the weapon, but the others wouldn't listen. They tore it from his grasp, their faces darkening into anger. When the general tried to take the pistol back, he was struck from behind. Falling to one knee, he felt more blows raining down on him. His friends had been replaced with others, men whom he had sent to their deaths in battles and skirmishes. Why did you kill us, they demanded. Why did you sacrifice us? Your precious career, your military strategies, were they worth trading for our lives? Dalton called to the doctor for help, but he heard no reply. Instead, he could just hear a distant screaming, like an animal in agony. After that, all was a blur of darkness and pain, voices swirling around him in a fever. The general had come too in the cell, surrounded by nearly a dozen of his men. Clark saluted and gave thanks that Dalton was still alive. They had thought him dead. So still had his body been since they arrived. The soldiers had no way of knowing how long they had been in this place. They claimed it was Dalton who had led them through the gateway before bringing them to this place. But the general knew that could not be true. Could it? Later, perhaps days, perhaps only hours, the door to the cell had opened inwards, and a young boy had peered inside. Dalton was eager to leave, but Clark and the others had volunteered to stay behind in the hope it might mask the general's escape. He had never been prouder of any men under his command, and told them so, saluting their bravery before he departed. The boy led him up a spiral stone staircase and out into the open air. "Run towards the darkness," the lad had said, pointing at a black stain on the horizon. "That leads you back." In the distance, a woman's voice was calling for the boy, summoning James for a morning feast. Dalton had run for what seemed like forever, wishing he was younger and fitter, regretting those late-night glasses of port and fine cigars. Suddenly, he was surrounded by the blackness, veins of it reaching out across the ground and sky. Ahead was a vertical aperture, like an eye turned on its side. The darkness was seeping out of that, reminding the general of festering, gangrenous wounds he had seen in field hospitals. Could this be the gateway to his world? He was about to venture forth into the aperture when it began to pulse and throb. Dalton could hear a familiar voice, urging others onwards, commanding them forwards. He retreated into the shadows beside the aperture, and watched as dozens of soldiers poured through, all soaked to the skin, looking around themselves in wonder. The voice ordered them forwards, telling them to walk towards their dearly departed. Dalton watched in fascination as the men marched onwards, now being led by a figure in a general's uniform. Once they had gone, Dalton emerged from the shadows and stood before the aperture. How had the soldiers been able to reach the gateway without diving suits? The general didn't want to think what fresh torments might be in front of him. He had no choice. He had to go back through and warn the others. It was his duty as an officer and a gentleman. Dalton filled his lungs with air and plunged into the aperture, letting the darkness envelop him. Hawthorne knew he was not a brave man. He had gone out of his way to avoid facing danger, always afraid he might be discovered a coward. So when the stranger had walked into the cell with Lady Nyssa, Hawthorne made sure his back was against the wall with several soldiers in front of him. The private did not believe he had anything to fear from the doctor's travelling companion. Her bewildered face betrayed only her gentle nature. But the man, his eyes had the same remorseless quality Hawthorne had seen in too many soldiers. The stranger would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. Strangely, Lady Nyssa called the man father, but Hawthorne could see no resemblance. The private felt the bile rising in his throat when Clark died. The sound of bones snapping in the lance corporal's neck stirred a memory. At Christmas, Hawthorne and Johnson had crept into the officers' mess after dinner and picked at the carcass of the turkey, scoffing down morsels left on the table. Next day, Nicholas had produced the dried wishbone and cajoled Hawthorne into pulling it with him. Johnson had won and wished for a night in the bed of a beautiful lady. The sound made by the bones in Clark's neck, they were just like the snapping of that wishbone. "Where is he? Where is the general?" Nobody spoke. "If you do not tell me, I shall kill you one by one until none are left, or somebody speaks. Well, what shall be your fate?" Before he realized what he was doing, Hawthorne had stepped forward to face this murderous fury. Somebody unlocked the door and the general escaped. He wanted all of us to go as well, but we volunteered to stay behind, so he would have a better chance. He should have found the gateway by now and gone back through to warn the others. The private sensed a flash of movement and felt a heavy punch crush his neck. He tried to cough, but the breath wouldn't come. Something warm and wet was gushing from his throat, coating his fingers in crimson. Hawthorne's legs went numb and folded underneath him, his torso falling sideways to the cold stone floor. He looked up to see the other soldiers staring down at him in horror, cowering away against the wall. I must be a right mess, Hawthorne realised. He heard Lady Nissa sobbing nearby, but couldn't seem to focus on her features. "You're not my father, you can't be," she said. "What are you?" Hawthorne closed his eyes and tried to remember a prayer, but none stirred from his memory. He wondered what happened to anyone who died in the afterlife. Volmer had his rifle ready to fire as a lone figure emerged from the water, facing the opposite side of the river. "Where am I?" the bedraggled man asked before turning around. It was the general, but he looked haggard, bruises mottling his face like marble. His eyes widened in surprise at seeing the Queen looking down at him from the pontoon. "Your Majesty," Dalton snapped into a salute. "If I may be so bold, what are you doing here?" "We travelled here at your request, General," Victoria replied tersely. "But I sent no such dispatch. I would never—" Dalton's voice trailed away, his hands shivering as cold water dripped from them. The Queen took command of the situation, telling Volmer to have fresh clothes laid out for the General. She invited Dalton to take his leave of the river and dry himself off. "Might we suggest a nip of whiskey to calm your nerves? Once you are ready, we would hear all you have to say. We suspect the truth is yet to emerge." Nissa sobbed, trying to ignore the gurgling sounds as another soldier died at her feet. Tremus spun round, his features contorted with malevolent fury. "Where is the boy? He brought you here. He discovered this place. He must have helped the General escape. Where is he?" Nissa shook her head, unable to answer. Tremus marched out of the cell, dragging her behind him. James had disappeared while they were inside with the prisoners. "He'll be trying to escape through the gateway." Tremas's face sneered at Nissa, but it spoke with an unearthly voice, its breath rank with sweet, sickly odours. "You will help us bring him back." "Your Majesty, I must ask you to leave this place immediately. It is not safe for you here." Dalton was now standing before the Queen in the tent prepared for her. Victoria was flanked by her trio of household guards, with the Doctor, Volmer and Clark to one side. "You keep saying this, but you do not tell us why. We require a reason." The General swallowed hard before responding. "Ma'am, I believe the gateway is, indeed, the portal to another world, but I do not think it can be considered any sort of paradise. Beyond this gateway is a purgatory of suffering and torment. Perhaps within that realm there is another portal leading to the true life ever after, but I did not find any evidence of that. All I experienced was horror and suffering, ma'am." The Queen appeared crestfallen at this news. "And you are certain of this?" "Yes, ma'am, upon my honour." "Very well. You have told us it is so, as has the Doctor. Without seeing this realm for myself, and with Master Lees already dead, it seems we must accept this truth, however painful it may prove." The Doctor stepped forward. "Your Majesty, I believe there is more at stake here than whether or not that portal leads to an afterlife. The General is correct when he says there is a grave threat present here, not just to your good self, but to all of mankind." "How so, Doctor?" "Before I can tell you, ma'am, there are some questions I must put to the General, with your permission." Victoria nodded her approval. The Doctor turned to Dalton. "How long were you on the other side of the gateway?" "Impossible to say. There were no days or nights. It could have been just a few hours or slightly longer." "So it would surprise you to learn that 2 days have passed since you and I entered the rift together." The General nodded, stunned by this revelation. "How many times have you been back and forth through the portal?" "Once when I entered that hellish place, and again on my way back. Why?" "Your Majesty, we have seen the General make 2 return trips through the gateway. He went back into it again not long before you arrived," the Doctor said. Volmer confirmed this, adding that Dalton seemed a changed man after arriving at Corallin. The doctor had another theory. The general did become a changed man, but only after his first return from the portal. At first I thought he was suffering from decompression sickness. I now believe the true Dalton was held prisoner beyond that rift, while a doppelganger came back in his place. "Oh, what?" the general asked. The Queen cleared her throat. "It is from the German, a legend about the ghostly duplicate of a living person." "Exactly, ma'am," the doctor said. "General, did you see any of your own men on the other side of the rift?" "Yes, I was held captive with close to a dozen of them. Clark here was among them," Dalton replied, pointing at the lance corporal. "Come to think of it, how did you get back here before me? Where are the others?" Clark smiled as he raised his rifle and aimed it at the Queen. "Nobody moves, or else I execute your monarch." The lance corporal made an unearthly noise through the side of his mouth, somewhere between a whistle and a bird of prey's cry. Soldiers rushed into the tent, quickly disarming the Queen's 3 guards and Volma. "So, you have been replacing the general's troops with your own kind," the doctor said. "But the doppelgangers have only entered into this world after the men they duplicate have travelled through to your side. At an educated guess, I would say you can't pass freely through the rift to this dimension. You need to replace someone who has already travelled to your realm." "Doctor, what are you talking about? What is happening here? If this is a mutiny, you shall all swing from the gallows for your treason," the Queen warned Clark. He stepped closer to her and pointed the end of his rifle at her forehead. "Be silent, or you shall join your beloved consort in the spirit world sooner than you expected." The doctor was still thinking out loud. "No duplicate of Nissa or myself, I notice. So, it's fair to surmise the doppelgangers can only adopt human form. The people of Traken or Gallifrey seem to be outside their repertoire. But what about James Lees? He went through the rift and came back years ago. Does that mean he was also a duplicate from beyond the rift? If so, where is the real James?" "A small boy called James helped me escape," Dalton whispered. "All of you, be silent," Clark commanded. "But why keep him alive?" the doctor sighed. "Still too many questions." "I said be silent." Clark smashed the butt of his rifle against the back of the doctor's head. The doctor crumpled to the ground, blood throbbing from the wound. "Why did you kill those men? They have done nothing to you." Nissa was being dragged through a rose garden by Trimas, but she knew this creature was not her father. "We did not want this," it snarled back. "We did not begin this. We knew of the thin membrane between our worlds, but avoided all contact with it. Beyond was only darkness and foreboding. It was beings from beyond the membrane that created the rift." "The people of Earth, they are not my kind," Nissa protested. "That much is true. We saw that in your mind. You wear my father's face and body like a mask. We took your memories, used them to recreate your father, your home." "And my mother? I never knew her. She died giving birth to me." "She was taken from the darkest place in your subconscious, spun out of your own fears and guilt. She was a mirror of your feelings." A rush of realization overwhelmed Nissa as her true memories began flooding back. "James Lees, the James I met before passing through the rift. He was one of your kind." "The boy chanced upon our world after the rift was created. We sent one of our own back in his place as an ambassador. But those beyond the membrane held him prisoner. They tortured him and they murdered him." Trimas snarled. "We cared for the boy as if he were one of us, and they murdered our ambassador. We shared his mind through it all, experienced all that he felt. He was dying, his human body collapsing under the strain of what he was made to do, reaching into their minds and recreating the voices of their dead. He just wanted to come home, but none would let him. Just as he was about to return, they killed him.
We all felt his passing. None of us had ever known or felt death before, but now we have. His death will spread among us, infecting us all, just as the horrors beyond the rift have infected our world with linear time. What kind of monsters live in such a nightmare? What more barbarity can they visit upon us?
Nissa shook her head. You're wrong. They don't understand what they have done. They don't mean your kind any harm.
Tremas stopped.
They had reached the edge of the rose garden. Ahead was just a barren plain, its horizon smeared with darkness. He pointed at the black, cancerous centre.
This was a place of light and joy once. Then they flung one of their unborn offspring into our world, covered in blood, murdered before its time. That one act created this hole in our world. We fought back, sending our thoughts through to warn them away, but still they came. We took the lives of those that had damaged us, but still they came. You say they don't mean us harm, yet the one called Dalton came here with thoughts of conquest and invasion and glory. The incursion of these monsters is destroying our world. That doom shall be visited back upon them. Tremas lurched forwards again, dragging Nissa towards the darkness. To my wife, Clara. I write this letter in the hope it may one day reach you, although that hope is increasingly forlorn. By now, you will probably know I was sent north into Scotland on a special mission. If you are reading this letter, it means someone has retrieved it from my body, and I am almost certainly dead. Please, do not grieve on my behalf. I cannot say I have been the best of husbands to you, for that would be a lie, and this is not the time for such falsehoods. I have been selfish and arrogant, and I have been no sort of husband for you, certainly not the husband you deserve. All my life I longed to meet a woman as kind and gentle as you. When I did, I thought myself the luckiest of men. But I failed you. Perhaps if we had been able to have a child, it would have brought us closer together. But when our marriage was not so blessed, we grew cold with each other, and so did our bed. I do not know who was to blame, and blame is not important any more. Just know this, and I can rest in peace, content to have made good with you at last. I love you more than I have loved anyone else in this life, certainly more than I have loved myself. I betrayed you, not with another woman, but with my heart. I turned away from you when you needed me most, and for that I can only beg God's forgiveness, if there is such a thing. I hope you find someone else who can grant you the happiness you so much deserve, and pray that one day you may forgive me my sins. If you still feel esteem towards me after reading this, on my birthday, will you go into a church and light a candle for me? I have no heir to carry on my family name, and will leave you little upon which to live. At least you will still remember me when I am gone. Forgive me, my darling Clara. Perhaps we shall see each other one day in a better place. Until then, I wish you well, and will picture your face as I pass from this life. Your loving husband, Charles Otto Vollmer. The sergeant folded away the letter and pushed it into a pocket for safekeeping. He had written it several nights earlier, after going through Lieutenant Ash's personal belongings. It seemed the right thing to do at the time, and now he was more certain of that than ever. He just had to hope someone would find the letter and deliver it to his wife. This is getting to be an unfortunate habit, the doctor said wryly, examining the shackles around his wrists and ankles. Speak for yourself, Vollmer replied. Some of us aren't so used to being held prisoner. Not by our own men. But these aren't our men, Dalton protested. If they were, I'd have them all up on a charge of mutiny. The trio had been chained to the exterior of the TARDIS, along with the 3 household guards. The Queen was being held captive elsewhere, while Clark and most of the doppelgangers were busy in the valley below. The river had all but disappeared now, just a few pools of water left in hollows. The general twisted his head sideways to look at the doctor. What the deuce do you think they are doing down there?
I have my suspicions, and none of them are very comforting. Volmer, what's in those crates they are taking to the riverbed?
Explosives. We bought enough to start a small war. Some were used to create the temporary dam upriver, but most are being positioned around that damned gateway. They seem intent on widening it.
By how much?
If they're not careful, most of this hillside will be blasted to Kingdom Come. That's what I was afraid of. What do you think they are planning, Doctor? Dalton asked. Blow a hole big enough to march an army through as the first phase of an invasion?
Nothing so prosaic. No, I think they want to further destabilize the weakness in the space-time continuum.
The what? Speak English, Doctor.
The rift. It's not a gateway between worlds. It's more like... He paused, apparently deep in thought.
More like what?
Sorry, I was recalling an old analogy of mine. Imagine the rift is like a tear in a paper bag full of water. The bigger the tear,
the more water escapes, Volmer suggested.
Quite. But what happens if the bag is suddenly torn apart?
The sergeant shrugged. No more bag, just pieces of paper left.
The doctor nodded. And whatever inside the bag is spilled out everywhere. But instead of water, it's the other side of the rift that will be spilling out here.
So, what's the paper bag?
This planet, everything and everyone you have ever known, cared about or loved will be destroyed, torn apart. This silenced the others.
It was Dalton who spoke first. Then we must find a way to stop these bounders, he announced. I won't stand here and let them threaten our queen and country. Sergeant?
Volmer nodded.
I'm in. What about the rest of you men?
The household guards all agreed. The sergeant turned back to the doctor.
But how can we stop them?
It will not be easy or without sacrifice, but little worth achieving ever is. Fortunately, those from beyond the rift are so intent on their task, they have left us momentarily unguarded. The doctor twisted his body sideways and then leaned back towards Volmer. Sergeant, can you reach my coat pocket? Your key should still be hidden inside.
Yes, just got it.
Good. Unlock your own shackles first. I need you and 2 of the enlisted men to set off first if we are to have any chance. Now, which of you is the best shot? One of the household guardsmen cleared his throat. I am. Private Morrison, Benjamin Morrison. I won the regimental medal for marksmanship. Ever killed a live target?
Yes, sir.
Well, I hope that will not be necessary today. You are our insurance policy. Nissa was surprised to see more than 30 British soldiers waiting outside the portal, gathered around a body slumped on the ground. Behind them, a pulsing black aperture towered over the scene, tendrils of darkness stretching outwards from it across the sky. The troopers seemed unaware of its throbbing, malevolent presence.
Those soldiers should be with the others. Tremas lurched towards the men. Where is your commanding officer?
The troopers parted to reveal General Dalton lying on the ground, a livid gash across his forehead. Private Johnson cleared his throat. He seems to have been injured, sir. We came through the gateway with the general, but just afterwards he cried out in pain. We've been waiting here for him to recover. Nissa, a voice whispered. She turned to see James step out of the shadows beside the aperture, clutching his slingshot. Now's our chance to go back. The doctor watched Morrison creep across the empty riverbed above Coralline to the opposite riverbank, the private staying in a low crouch to avoid being seen by the doppelgangers below. Dalton appeared at the doctor's side, bloody hands clutching a small wooden box.
Got it, the general hissed. Let's see those scoundrels blow anything up without the detonator.
How many did you kill to get that? The doctor asked quietly.
Just one. Cracked him across the head with a rock, opened his skull like an egg.
The doctor shook his head sadly. That wasn't necessary.
I am a warrior, Doctor. I fought for what's right all my life, and I fully intend to die fighting. Dalton wiped the worst of the blood off his hands. Now what? I have to resolve a dilemma, the doctor replied. My friend Nissa, the boy James, and your soldiers are still trapped on the other side of the rift. The leader of the British Empire is being held captive by beings from another world. The fabric of time and space is about to be ripped apart. The TARDIS isn't ready for another trip yet, and in a few minutes a flash flood will seep down this valley, drowning everything in its path. He sighed. No matter what I do, I can't save everyone. Where do you think Nissa and the boy will be? Hopefully trying to find their way back to this side of the rift. But I can't risk trying to rescue them and becoming trapped on the other side. I will need the TARDIS to repair the damage if those explosives around the rift are detonated. Dalton glanced at the tall blue box nearby. Your equipment, it can fix the... how did you put it? Fix the hole in the paper bag? Yes, I think so. In that case, the solution is simple, the general said. You distract those invaders long enough, and I will go through the rift. With any luck, I can rally my men and get your friend and the boy back here before it's too late. But you must also protect Her Majesty. The doctor looked at Dalton closely. You realize what happens if you don't make it back through the rift? The general nodded. In all conflicts, some sacrifices have to be made. He handed over the detonator. This should provide excellent bait for your diversion. Good luck, Doctor. At the temporary dam, Volmer and the 2 household guards had almost finished preparing the explosives. The doctor had given precise instructions about the best positions in which to place the charges and how to wire them in sequence. Once the first one blows, it will set off a chain reaction. That should destabilize the structure enough for the weight of the water beyond it to start pushing through the gaps. When that happens... But how will I know when to detonate? The sergeant had asked. From that far upriver, we'll have no idea if it is safe for you and the others to set off the explosives. The doctor had nodded grimly. We have one advantage over our enemy. Surprise! When we hear the explosions, we'll know what's coming. I estimate anyone in the path of the water will have 30 seconds to get clear. A minute at most. Just detonate when you're ready. We can't afford to wait any longer. Now go! Volmer shoved the last of his explosives into a crevice halfway up the dam, below 2 large boulders. He looked round at the men who had been helping him. All the other charges in place? They nodded nervously. Good. Now we start wiring them together. The doppelganger Clark was supervising the placement of the explosives beneath the gateway, using the knowledge he had torn from the real Lance Corporal's mind. The soldiers had to shield their eyes as they worked, so bright was the glare from the gap in the riverbank. Clark urged his men to work faster, all too aware that the light escaping outwards into this world was bleeding from his own. But soon the bleeding would be staunched, one way or another. All that remained was to connect a cable to the detonator. But when Clark sent a private to fetch the box, he returned empty-handed. You haven't been looking for this, have you? The shouted voice was that of the doctor, but Clark could not be sure from where it had come. Sound bounced around the sandstone boulders, deceiving the senses. I'm up here! A lone figure waved at the soldier from atop Coral Inn, holding a small wooden box up in the air. You'll find it surprisingly difficult to explode all of that without a detonator. I'm just off to rescue Her Majesty. Did anybody want to stop me? Clark shouldered his rifle and fired at the doctor, the other soldiers following his example. Once the shooting had stopped, he reappeared above them. Is that the best you can do? You're all a disgrace to those uniforms. Get that detonator! Clark commanded, sending half his men up one side of the precipice and the rest up the other side. He was so intent on following their progress, he didn't notice the lone figure slipping into the rift. Nissa crouched beside the boy. Even if we go back, there is no guarantee you'll find the home you expect, James.
Time moves differently here. The life you knew, it's gone. I don't care, he whispered. I still want to go back. I don't belong here. Nissa stood up again and looked over at Johnson and the other soldiers. But we can't leave those men here either. We have to take them back with us. The real General Dalton stepped through the aperture. Don't worry about my men, Lady Nissa. I'll take care of them. You and the lad had best be getting back while you still can. My men and I will do the rest. Now go. The duplicate Clark could no longer see his men. All the doppelgangers had clambered up the sides of Coral Inn in pursuit of the doctor, disappearing beyond the rock precipice. Clark knew from the memories of the real Lance Corporal that another detonator had been left at the temporary dam. If necessary, they could recover that one and use it to blow the rift apart. Clark heard Gravel moving behind him and spun round, rifle ready to fire. "You're—" Nissa had just stepped through the portal, carrying James on her left hip. "Not much of a welcome," she said. "I put my hands up, but they're full, as you can see." "How did you escape?" Clark demanded. "I think you have more pressing concerns," Nissa replied, looking over Clark's shoulder to the other side of the riverbank. She rested a hand over James's eyes. "Don't look," she whispered to the boy. A single shot rang out, and Clark fell to the ground, clutching his wounded arm. A soldier emerged from behind rocks at the far side of the riverbed. "The doctor sent me. We must get you away from here. That shot will soon bring back the others." "Your Majesty?" The doctor stepped into the Queen's tent, still carrying the detonator. She was sitting in a chair, her hands clutching a locket. Inside was a tiny picture of her late husband. "Doctor, we thought you had been taken prisoner." Victoria stroked one finger across the portrait before snapping the locket shut. "For that matter, where are our captors?" "The guard outside your tent is unconscious and will be for some hours." The doctor's words were cut off by a single shot in the distance. "It has begun. Your Majesty, you must leave this place. I cannot guarantee your safety." The Queen stood, shaking off his concern. "No, Doctor. We came here for a purpose, and that has not yet been fulfilled." Then the screaming began. General Dalton strode towards the soldiers, his back ramrod straight, his chin held high. "What is the meaning of this? Why are your men not properly acknowledging the presence of a senior officer?" he demanded. The 36 men turned as one and automatically snapped to attention. Then they saw the face of the officer approaching them. None dared speak for several seconds, Johnson finally breaking the silence. "General Dalton, but you can't be there. You're over here." The private pointed down at the prone body on the ground. It still wore the uniform of a general in the British Army, but the face was just a blur. Standing over the body was another creature, its features also abandoning their human characteristics. The creature threw back its head and screamed, a terrifying cry rending the air. Dalton and the soldiers tried to shield their ears from the cacophony, blood beginning to trickle from their noses. "Fall back," the general screamed. "Fall back to the gateway." "Gute Frechen." The voice was indistinct at first, just a muttering beneath the horrific scream. But the words soon became more audible, along with the sound of someone approaching the outside of the tent. "Are you there?" "Albert?" The Queen strained to hear the voice. "My beloved, is that you?" "Wiebchen, where are you?" "Coming, my beloved, I'm coming." Victoria began to leave the tent, but the doctor stepped in front of her. "Your Majesty, listen to me. That voice, it may sound like your husband, but it is an illusion. Do not believe it," he urged. "I must go to him. No, your Majesty, you have to listen to me. Come to me, kleines Frauchen. Let me embrace you again." Victoria pushed open the tent. Standing outside was the corpse of the duplicate James Lees, its face contorted back into some semblance of life.
Lids fluttered over sightless eyes, and dark crimson blood splattered from between blue lips. The head was tilted to one side, while both arms were raised in a crude mockery of someone waiting to be hugged. "My Wiebchen, my love," the corpse whispered, speaking with Prince Albert's voice. "No, no," Victoria cried out before fainting into the doctor's arms. He lowered her carefully to the ground before approaching the grisly apparition. The doctor stood in front of the resurrected corpse and folded his arms. "If you want the Queen, you'll have to get past me." When the screaming began, James went into spasm, his body twisting and jerking out of Nissa's grasp. He fell to the ground, his head cracking against the rock. The private ran across the dry riverbed past the wounded duplicate of Clark to help Nissa with the boy. "We must get you both away from here," Morrison shouted, straining to be heard over the cry howling out from inside the rift. "This whole valley will be underwater within minutes." Nissa bent over James's face, straining to hear anything but the nerve-jangling screech. "He's stopped breathing. We can't risk moving him. I have to revive him first." She pressed her mouth over the boy's lips, was pinching his nose shut, and blew. James's chest rose and fell as Nissa tried to breathe life back into him. "You cannot stop us," the doppelganger gurgled. It stretched out an arm to grab at Morrison. The soldier lashed out with his rifle, smashing the butt into the imposter's head. The duplicate cried out in pain, its face distorting into a featureless blur. Morrison began reloading his rifle, fingers working urgently while his eyes searched the surrounding hills. "We're sitting ducks out here. Those things could be back at any moment." Nissa stopped to listen again. "There, I think. Yes, he's breathing again." Morrison scooped up the boy in his arms and began striding to the edge of the riverbank. Nissa followed him, but it was already too late. A single shot rang out, ricocheting off a rock in front of Morrison. "I don't think so," Private Hawthorne's doppelganger said, no trace of emotion in his voice. He was standing atop Coral Inn with the other duplicates, looking down at the trio. The impostors raised their weapons and took aim at Nissa, James, and Morrison. General Dalton had formed his men into 3 ranks of 12. Those with their backs to the aperture were standing, the soldiers in the middle rank were crouching on one knee, and the men of the front row were lying on the ground. All had their rifles loaded and ready to fire. They just needed a target. The screaming continued, tearing at their minds, but the source of the cacophony had melted away into the distance. "I promised the doctor we would hold our positions here and keep the enemy at bay until Her Majesty could be taken to safety," the general explained, shouting to be heard above the caterwauling. "We don't know how long that will be, nor do we know the strength of our foe. Heaven knows what monsters they can conjure up to send against us. Whatever happens, we must stand our ground. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," the soldiers replied in unison. "Very well." Dalton nodded with satisfaction. He would have expected no less, but it made him proud to stand alongside such men. The general planned to recommend them all for commendation, if they got out of this purgatory alive. Then the demons came. "Your plan seems to be going awry," the doctor commented. "What was it? Persuade the Queen to go through the portal, then replace her with one of your doppelgangers in preparation for an invasion. Why change the plan? You must know blowing apart that rift risks destroying your own world as well as this one." "You do not understand," the corpse gurgled, now speaking in the voice of Adric. "You know nothing of what you speak." It explained about the infection seeping outwards from the rift, how its kind had lost their immortality to the contagion of linear time. The doctor was aghast at hearing this. "It was you who sent the ghost of Adric to the TARDIS, wasn't it?" "Yes. We reached out sideways across time and space to find you, drawing you to one of our kind. We believed you could help us stop this invasion, but they kept coming, more and more of them dooming our world. So we decided to strike back." "Speak in your own voice. You have no need to hide behind the dead anymore." "Very well." The boyish tones of Adric were replaced by a harsh, guttural voice. Each word was gasped, forced out through the stiffening vocal cords of the duplicate James's corpse. "This body was once our ambassador to this world, but it was abused, tortured, and finally murdered. We shall have our vengeance." "Not this way," the doctor said. "The people of this world seem barbaric to you, but they are just children." "We have experienced what they do to their own children. Why should we do any different to them?" "Go back now," the doctor pleaded, "while you still have a chance. You brought me here to help. Let me do that. Let me seal the rift from this side permanently. Perhaps a way can still be found to isolate the effects of this contagion." "No, it is too late for that. We shall do unto this world what it has done to ours." The first explosion silenced the creature. The doctor's shoulders sagged. "You should have gone back when you had the chance," he said. "Now, it's too late." The doctor looked back at the unconscious body of the Queen. "You open your eyes and see him. Is this another dream, you ask?" He smiles and nods. "Yes," he says. "I came to say goodbye." You run forward and embrace him, wanting to hold him one last time. "Don't leave me," you beg. "Please don't leave me again." "I have to go. I have to move on," he says sadly. He reaches down and gently touches your chin, tipping your face up so he can look into your eyes one last time. You must do the same. You shake your head, not wanting to hear the words. "You know I'm right," he says. "Find a new happiness." He kisses you once on the forehead, and then steps back and smiles. "Remember me," he whispers. You close your eyes, and when you open them, he is gone. Nissa was pulled back to reality by the explosions, dull crumps of noise echoing down the valley. Atop Coralline, the doppelgangers looked about in confusion. "That's the dam being blown," Morrison shouted to Nissa. "We've got to get out of here before the flash flood hits." He was already running towards the riverbank, still holding James in his arms. Nissa followed his example. "Don't let them escape," shouted the duplicate Hawthorne. "Open fire!" "It didn't work," Volmer said, leaning back against a tree. When the dust began to clear, the temporary dam was still in place. A few new holes had been created in it, but the rest of the structure remained resolute against the Clyde. "We must have put the explosives in the wrong places." The sergeant rubbed a hand through his hair, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. It had all been for nothing. As the last echoes of the explosions died away, a new sound could be heard. Faint at first, but growing ever louder, was a distinct hissing. Volmer peered down into the valley. "What the hell?" His words faltered as he saw the streams of water arcing outwards from the dam. A deep rumbling began to build, overwhelming all other noises. "It's going!" the sergeant screamed in delight. "It's going!" With that, a huge chunk of the dam was pushed out of place, tumbling away in a mighty surge of water. More and more of the dam began to give way as the river tore through, resuming its journey down the valley. "Front rank, fire!" The first row of 12 shot at the advancing creatures and immediately began to reload. "Middle rank, fire!" the general bellowed, the men of that row following the example of those in front of them. "Rear rank, fire!" By this time the first row was ready again, their rifles taking aim at the enemy. "Front rank, fire!" The creatures were humanoid, but the resemblance stopped there as far as Dalton could see. Faces were demonic visages, the stuff of battlefield nightmares. Bodies were mottled blues and greys, flailing masses of flesh that seemed to blur before the general's eyes. They attacked in waves, flinging themselves at the soldiers. Dalton knew that the supply of ammunition his men were carrying was limited. There seemed no way they could win this battle. But he had made a promise to the doctor, and that promise would be kept. It was his duty, and the duty of all his men. It was their honour. To one side of the main enemy force, the general saw the creature that had been masquerading as him. It had recovered and was now directing the demonic attackers with that damnable screaming. Dalton drew his service revolver and took careful aim, a single shot blowing the creature's head apart. The screaming stopped, just the sound of battle filling the air. "That's better," the general muttered. As the last echoes of the scream faded away, the dead duplicate of James collapsed to the ground. Whatever force had been animating it was gone. The doctor examined the corpse before gently closing its eyelids. "Rest in peace." Victoria stirred on the ground. The doctor crouched beside the Queen, helping her sit up. "Your Majesty, are you all right?" She nodded, her eyes wet with tears, one hand still clasped around the locket. "I saw him," Victoria whispered. "Not one of those impostors. I saw my beloved." Their attention was distracted by the sound of approaching thunder. The doctor stood up, tilting his head to one side as he listened to the growing crescendo. "The river," he realized. "Nyssa!" The doctor turned back to the Queen. "Your Majesty, if there is still a chance to save my friend, go!" she urged. Morrison cried out in agony, stumbling on the stones as one of the shots punctured his right leg. Nyssa turned back to see the private struggling to reach the side of the riverbed. "Give me James!" she called. More shots zipping past her as she returned to Morrison. "No, keep going!" he shouted. "You're wounded, you won't make it," Nyssa replied, struggling to be heard over the gunfire. Another sound was growing louder by the second. "That's the river coming for us. Now come on! We can carry him if we work together." Morrison nodded at the sense of this and let Nyssa take the boy's legs. Together they began to clamber up the side of the valley, shots still raining down on them from the soldiers atop Coralline. Suddenly the doctor was by their side. He grabbed James and began running back up the hill. "Nyssa, help the private to safety." The quartet clawed their way upwards, the roar of the approaching river growing ever louder, overwhelming all words. The air around them was becoming moist as spray was thrown ahead of the surging flood. Then, when Nyssa thought the noise could get no louder, the water was upon them all. She stopped to look back, turning in time to see the torrent burst over Coralline. It threw the soldiers into the air like a playful cat before dashing their bodies onto the rocks below. The deluge hit the riverbed and exploded, flying forwards and sideways and swallowing everything in its path. The water tore at the banks, trees and boulders from the shattered dam joining the tumult. Coralline was alive again and reaching out, determined to engulf all around it. Nyssa ran on up the hill, the ground crumbling away beneath her feet, the river rampaging around her. She slipped and almost slid back down into the hungry water, but Morrison grabbed her arm and pulled her to safety. Still the deafening noise roared on, before finally beginning to abate. Nyssa realized she was soaked to the skin. But she was alive. Volmer was last back to camp, his side aching from a stitch. He had stopped running and walked the final section, watching the last remnants of the temporary dam floating by. The sergeant found Nyssa nursing a young boy, while Morrison was tending to his wound. There was no sign of the other household guards or the doctor. Nyssa explained all she could about what had happened. "Who's the boy?" Volmer asked. "James Lees," Nyssa replied. "The real James Lees. He went through the rift 7 years ago. Time moves differently on the other side, so he grew only a few days older." "The Queen? Is she safe?" Morrison nodded as he wrapped a bandage around his leg. "She's with the doctor. The others went downstream to search for any survivors. Dalton, the real Dalton, went through to try and bring his men back. But then the waters came." "We could use the diving suit to try to rescue them," the sergeant suggested. Nyssa shook her head. "It was destroyed by the flash flood. The general and his men are trapped on the other side." Volmer digested all of this before speaking again. I'll go and help with the search. It seems that's all there is left to do. Victoria waited until the doctor had finished his explanations of all that had happened before speaking. A fascinating tale, but I don't know how much of it to believe. She sighed and shook her head. We don't know how much of it to believe. A smile crept across her face. Sometimes it can be most vexing remembering where being a monarch stops and a woman begins. The doctor nodded. He hesitated before venturing advice to the Queen. Your Majesty, whatever happened here, it can never be spoken of. Of course not. They would think me madder than my grandpapa. She looked down at her locket, regarding the tiny portrait inside. Do you believe in ghosts, Doctor? I like to believe almost anything is possible in heaven and earth, Your Majesty. Victoria nodded. Have faith, and faith shall be given you. Something like that. When I collapsed, I fell into a dream. My beloved Albert spoke to me and held me and said goodbye. He said I should find a new happiness. Victoria looked intently at the doctor. Was that real? Was it his ghost? Or just another illusion, another phantom? I was so certain that Master Lees was speaking in the voice of my late husband, but now I know not what to believe any more. What does your heart tell you? The Queen pondered that, and then nodded to herself. Then let your heart be your guide, ma'am. He bowed to her. Now, if you'll excuse me, there is one last task I must perform. It was nearly dusk when the doctor emerged from the TARDIS and joined the others by a roaring fire in the centre of the camp. Well, the gateway is shut again. The pressure of all that water and debris has blocked the entrance again, for good this time. What's happened to the soldiers? James asked sleepily. He had regained consciousness and appeared remarkably untroubled by his time beyond the rift. We found no trace of them downstream, Volmer said. He chose not to tell the boy about the faceless corpses he and the others had recovered from the shoreline. At the Queen's insistence, the bodies were to be given proper funerals, as befitted any fallen soldiers. There was no way back for Dalton and his men, the doctor admitted. The general knew that might well happen when he volunteered to go back through the rift and rally his troops. They sacrificed themselves for a greater good. But perhaps their sacrifice will show something of mankind's nobility to those on the other side. The general and his troops shall be listed as missing in action, presumed dead, an imperious voice announced. They shall receive funerals with full military honours. The Queen emerged from her tent, ready to depart for Lanark. Volmer and the other soldiers saluted. Night is fast drawing in. It is time for us all to move on, she said. Your Majesty, Nyssa and I shall not be travelling with you, the doctor said. Our journey will take a different path. Very well, she replied. But you shall continue to be our scientific adviser for as long as you wish, Doctor. It is the least we can do to thank you. Thank you, Your Majesty. Volmer let the other soldiers go on ahead with the Queen and James. He waited until the royal entourage was out of earshot before speaking to the doctor and Nyssa. Well, I'll be back in the morning with a team of men to tidy everything up and supervise removal of the bodies. Will you still be here? No, the doctor replied. Our business here is done. He shook the sergeant's hand. Goodbye, Volmer, and good luck for the future. The soldier rolled his eyes. After this, I think army life will be rather boring. It's time I considered a new profession. What will happen to James? Nyssa asked. Volmer shrugged. We'll try to find his family, but heaven knows where they'll be by now. Failing that, he can stay with me and Clara for a while. We've always wanted children of our own, and I'm starting to think I should be spending more time at home. He nodded to them both, then went quietly on his way, disappearing into the darkness. Extract from Observations and Analysis, a journal. I waited until we were back in the TARDIS before questioning the Doctor. I knew he had not told the whole truth about the rift. He admitted using the TARDIS to seal the gateway. I managed to impose another dimensional buffer over it, a permanent divide this time. That will gradually heal the rift, repairing the weakness in the space-time continuum. I remembered how slowly time moved on the other side. The General and his men could still be alive there, still fighting their battle. Yes. For decades yet, as time is measured on this world, even centuries. I dare not risk trying to rescue them, in case it reopens the rift. I warned Dalton of the consequences if he got trapped on the other side, but he was determined to go back there. And his men? What choice did they have, Doctor? We can't save everyone, Nissa. You, of all people, should know that by now. Like my father, or Adric, death comes to us all. Learning to accept our own mortality, that is the greatest lesson. I pointed out there was still so much we did not know. How had the rift between worlds first been created? What was the other side like before Earth began to infect it? The Doctor nodded. Perhaps we will never know all the answers. He finished setting the controls for our next journey and looked at me. How do you feel? The wound in my chest had been healing rapidly since I stepped back through the rift, while my psychic flashes had stopped for the moment. Perhaps it had been my proximity to the doppelganger James and the rift that triggered them. I realised the Doctor was still waiting for my answer, so I told him about my final vision from just before the temporary dam was blown apart, of my father saying goodbye. It was different from the others, I said. More real somehow. The Doctor walked around the console unit to stand in front of me. No, I meant, how do you feel? He asked. I still wasn't convinced by his diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder and told him so. Well, one wouldn't want to be right all the time, he replied. It seemed to fit the facts, but, as you pointed out, you are not from Earth. So there's no reason why such a... I feel better, I said, cutting him short. Thank you. The Doctor smiled. Good. But I wouldn't say no to a hug.